Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony, which today commemorates the service and sacrifice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Australian Defence Force, as part of the memorial's NAIDOC Week activities. We acknowledge the original custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. We also welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today or are watching the live stream. My name is Craig Burrell, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force is leading aircraft woman Shania Sadler. This evening's last post ceremony tells the story of an Aboriginal serviceman as part of NAIDOC Week, in which we celebrate the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and recognise them as the traditional custodians of the land. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a long and proud history of fighting for country and continue to serve with honour among our military forces. They have served in every conflict and commitment involving Australian defence contingents since Federation, including both World Wars. This evening, we contemplate the sacrifices that Indigenous Australians have made and continue to make in defence of country. We warmly welcome the family of Private Walter Parker, who are watching the live stream of this evening's ceremony online. Private Parker's story will be told shortly. We are honoured to acknowledge the delegation representing Defence Indigenous Affairs. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors to the memorial. If you are able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. Please be seated if you can do so. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the hearts of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Private Walter Parker. Walter Parker was born on the 6th of July 1874 in Gin, Western Australia. His father was stockman Joseph Mortimer. His mother was a Noongar woman named Mary Elizabeth Benyap. Shortly after Walter's birth, his mother married John Parker and Walter took his surname. Little is known about Walter's early life, but records suggest that he moved from Greenough in the Midwest region of Western Australia where he worked as a labourer. In October 1899, after a worsening political deadlock in southern Africa, Boer forces invaded British colonies of Cape Colony and Natal. Britain declared war on the two Boer republics, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic. In support of the British Empire, the Australian colonies committed troops to the conflict. Parker volunteered for service in the first contingent of soldiers raised in Western Australia, but was rejected for reasons that are unclear. While it is possible he was rejected because he was Aboriginal, there were more volunteers and spaces available in each contingent. In early 1901, the 5th and 6th contingent were raised. Then working in the goldfields town of Coolgardie, volunteered for service and was successful. He joined the 5th Western Australian Mounted Infantry. After initial training at Calcutta in early March, he and his unit departed from Fremantle on board the transport ship Devon. The 5th contingent arrived in Durban at the end of March. The 6th contingent arrived a month later. The two contingents were amalgamated in South Africa, forming a battalion of mounted infantry. When Parker arrived at the front, the war had entered its final stage, which would prove to be long and drawn out. In the previous years, British forces had captured the capital cities of both Boer republics, as well as many large towns and the railways. In the face of considerable losses, the Boer commanders had decided to continue their guerrilla war against the British. By late 1901, the British Commander-in-Chief, Lord Kitchener, had begun a scorched earth campaign, interning Boer civilians in concentration camps and sending columns of mounted infantry in drives across the veldt, hoping to capture or defeat his enemies. Serving under British and Australian officers, the Western Australian Mounted Infantry took part in these operations in the Eastern Transvaal. The conditions were extremely trying. In order to counter the Boers' main advantage of mobility, British Mounted Infantry had to travel light. In September, the Western Australian troops were ordered to leave all tents and kit at camp before surrounding the town of Ermelo. After the town was captured, it was burnt to the ground. The troops then spent 2 weeks in incessant rain without shelter. British logistics throughout the war were poor and clean water was hard to come by. More than half of the Australian soldiers who died in South Africa died of illness. Parker fell ill and was taken to the military hospital of the town of Standerton. He had contracted typhoid fever, commonly described in the records at the time as enteric fever. His condition worsened and he died at Standerton on the 22nd of January 1902. Buried in the Standerton Cemetery, Private Walter Parker was 27 years old, the earliest known Aboriginal servicemen to have died on active service. Two of Parker's younger half-brothers, Harry and James Dickerson, volunteered for service in the First World War. Trooper James Dickerson served in the 10th Light Horse Regiment and was killed on Gallipoli in August 1915. Private Harry Dickerson, the youngest, served in the 3rd Machine Gun Squadron throughout the Palestine campaign and returned to Australia in 1919. Walter Parker's name is enlisted on the Roll of Honour on my right, alongside almost 600 Australians who died while serving in the Boer War. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Walter Parker, who gave his life for us, for his country, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We'll remember them. Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director and staff, we thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening.